Hello everybody, we're going to begin this presidential election series with the election of 1788-1789. Over the next 2 weeks or so, we're going to do a review of every single presidential election that has happened so far in the United States. We're going to take a look at the candidates, we're going to do the background, we're going to do the issues, we're going to take a look at those election results. So, let's get it done right now. So the first election, 1788-1789, took place from December 15th, 1788 to January 10th, 1789. Up until the election of 1848, presidential elections in the United States did not take place on a single day. It was only 1848 when that changed, but that'll be for a future election video. Now, before this election, the United States had no chief executive. They had no chief executive. Before the Constitution came around, the governing document of the United States was the Articles of Confederation. And if you learned something like this from American history, you would know that the Articles of Confederation was very weak. For the most part, all the power went to the states. And it was purposefully done that way because people were in fear of a strong government because they just got out of a tyrannical one with Britain. So they don't want to go back to something that they just got out of. So they gave the states most of the power, and this turned out to be a disaster. And by 1787, these guys came to realize that, hey, we're not going to have a country much longer if we continue to run our government in this way. So some delegates meet up in Philadelphia, and their original intent was to revise the Articles of Confederation. But what ended up happening was the 86th, that whole document, and they started fresh. They created a new document called the Constitution, and on September the 17th, 1787, which is called Constitution Day in the United States, the Constitution was finished, and it was signed, and it was approved by the convention. So they sent the Constitution out to the states for ratification. In Article 7, it says that 9 of the 13 states had to ratify the Constitution in order for it to become effective. June 21st, 1788, that happened when New Hampshire became the 9th state to ratify the Constitution. So therefore, the Constitution came into effect, and we had our first elections under this new government. This Constitution created the office of president. So 1788-1789 was the first presidential election. This is the only presidential election to not take place in a multiple of 4. In a year, that is a multiple of 4. Now, there was a presiding officer during the days of the Articles of Confederation, the President of the Confederation Congress, but it was only a ceremonial position. There were a few executive departments, but no independent executive branch. Now, I want to emphasize a couple of things here. Number one, we do not have the 12th Amendment. So before I read off the candidates for this election, the old Electoral College system, up until the 12th Amendment was ratified in 1804, electors voted for 2 people for president. Whoever, after all the electoral votes were tallied up, whoever won first place became president. Whoever won second place, however, became vice president. This is going to become a problem later on, and we'll talk about that in future election videos, but it's not really a problem here. Also, we don't have any political parties at this time, but we did have factions. You were either a Federalist who supported the ratification of the Constitution, who believed in a strong national government, or you were an anti-federalist who was against the ratification of the Constitution and who was against a big government. The number one reason why, by the way, the anti-federalists opposed the ratification of the Constitution is because it didn't have a Bill of Rights. The Federalists believed that a Bill of Rights wasn't needed because the Constitution had enough protections for the people. Now, George Washington. George Washington, he ran as an independent. You can't get through a day of history class without knowing about this guy. You know, Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. He's from Virginia. He had a lot of slaves. He had a nice house at Mount Vernon. You know, things like that. He was the presiding officer of the Constitutional Convention. He was immensely popular. He was immensely popular with the American people. And for obvious reasons, because, you know, this guy won the American Revolution from us. He was the guy that assured our separation from Britain. So, pretty sure everybody in the country loved this guy. And as a result, he ran for president unopposed. But remember, no 12th Amendment. So he has people running against him. But the real issue in this election is who is going to be the vice president. Who is going to be the runner-up. Because again, Washington runs essentially unopposed. Now, some of the Federalist candidates, we're going to read them off here, are John Adams. He was a former minister to Great Britain. He's from Massachusetts. The Secretary of Foreign Affairs, John Jay of New York. He would eventually become the first Supreme Court Justice. John Rutledge, who was a former governor of South Carolina. John Hancock, who's the governor of Massachusetts. Samuel Huntington, who is the governor of Connecticut. And Benjamin Lincoln, who was a former Secretary of War. The War Department didn't exist at this time, but nevertheless, he was some kind of war secretary from Massachusetts. Now, the Anti-Federalists putting up only one major candidate, and that is the governor of New York, George Clinton. So we have our candidates, so we're going to get into the background here a little bit. Now, no political party, so there really isn't going to be any campaigning going on. So this election really doesn't have a partisan base. It's not until the next election, 1792, that an election in the United States is really run on a partisan basis. Now, the framers of the Constitution had presumed that Washington would be the first president, and once he agreed to come out of retirement to accept the office, there was really nobody there to oppose him. Now, in a letter, now Washington, he was a Virginian. He was from Virginia. So many assumed that a vice president would be chosen from one of the states in the North, you know, to ease sectional tensions between North and South. Now, in a letter dated August 1788, Thomas Jefferson, who was a minister of France, wrote that he considered John Adams and John Hancock, both of Massachusetts. You know, John Adams, a prominent Massachusetts citizen, and Hancock, the governor of the state, to be the top contenders. Jefferson also suggested, you know, Secretary Jay, James Madison, and John Rutledge as other possible candidates. James Madison is from Virginia. Now, rumors. Now, although we don't have any political parties, we really don't have any issues to talk about in this election, there was still some trickery. And this came from the anti-feds. There was this rumor, as the electors were being selected, that Richard Henry Lee or Patrick Henry, there was a plot to get either one of those guys elected over Washington, with George Clinton with Governor Clinton as their choice for vice president. Now, we don't know if any of this is true, and these rumors may have been encouraged by those sympathetic to the Federalists who wished to discourage electors from voting for Clinton. Now, if these rumors were true, if this happened, the strategy was effective. Clinton received only 3 electoral votes in this election, possibly due to the fear that a vote for Clinton was effectively a vote against Washington. Now, I also want to make this point. Only 6 states counted the popular vote when choosing their electors. So that's a big point right there. And also, less than 1.3% of the population voted. In the latter portion of the 18th century, if you didn't own property, if you were not a white man, and if you didn't own property, you could not vote. So suffrage only lied with rich, land-owning white men. So obviously, if you were a poor white man, if you were a slave, or if you were a woman, you could not vote. And speaking of voting, let's get to the results right now. Washington is going to win this election. He's going to win it unanimously. He's going to win 69, all 69 of the votes in the Electoral College. New York's legislature could not make up their minds, so they didn't participate in this election. And North Carolina and Rhode Island did not ratify the Constitution yet. What are you doing not ratifying the Constitution? It's supposed to be ratified by all 13 states. But they didn't ratify it at this point, so they couldn't participate in this election. Eventually they do, but they don't at this point. Now, as far as vice president is concerned, John Adams is elected the first vice president. He gets a plurality of the electoral votes for vice president. He gets 34 electoral votes, and there's a reason for that, and we'll talk about that in just a second. I'm going down the list here. John Jay got 9 electoral votes. Robert H. Harrison, a Federalist from Maryland, got 6 electoral votes. John Rutledge, a Federalist from South Carolina, got 6 electoral votes. John Hancock got 4 electoral votes. George Clinton got 3. Samuel Huntington and John Milton of Georgia each got 2. And James Armstrong of Georgia, Benjamin Lincoln, and Edward Telfair of Georgia each got 1 electoral vote. Now, why did Adams get a plurality and not a majority? This was due, for the most part, to a scheme that was perpetrated by Alexander Hamilton, who would eventually become the first Secretary of the Treasury. He feared that Adams would tie in the election with Washington. And under the new Constitution, this election would go to the House of Representatives. And this would embarrass Washington. This would embarrass the new Constitution. So, as a result of this, Adams only received a plurality, 34 electoral votes. The other guys that I mentioned combined, they received 35. But nevertheless, it really doesn't matter. We have our first president, George Washington. We have our second president, John Adams. We have elections to the first Congress out of the way. So now we have ourselves a new government. Washington is going to serve his first term, and he considers retirement in 1792, but he is going to go for it. We'll talk about that next time. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you got a lot out of this. I hope you're going to get a lot out of these election videos. And we will see you next time.